Welcome to another episode of Excuse Me, Doctor. Thank you for joining me, my Be Health Empowered family. My name is Dr. Melissa Clarke. Of course, call me Dr. Mel. I am really happy to be back here with you this week and every week because we do what we do here at Excuse Me, Doctor, which is bring you the information that you need to make wise health decisions, not just for yourself, but also for your family and for your community. And of course, we're streaming on YouTube. We're on Facebook. If you're new to the audience or if you haven't done it yet, please hit that subscribe button on YouTube and hit that like button on Facebook. Really appreciate you for that. And like I said, we are here to make sure that you have the information you need. So that might mean that you have some questions. So we want to make sure that you put those questions in the chat because we do it on a first come, first type basis. So please go ahead and join the conversation. Put your comments in, put your questions in. We want to hear from you. And, you know, as always, I can't do this without my fabulous co-producer, co-host, Mr. Wayne Bruce, who is bringing
I gotta get this straight. It look like I'm in a tight box. Look like I gained about 800 pounds of the tight box. What is going on with this picture? There we go. There we go.
That looks
Dr. Mel. I feel better now, Dr. Mel.
I'm really happy to hear that. And you can bring us what's on everybody's mind, be their voice in the studio. But most importantly, we have, and I am so excited because we have Miss Bria Good.
Ho. What are you doing?
What?
You reading my lines?
No, I'm not. I'm excited that Bria is here.
No, you reading my lines. We have a whole thing, a whole build-up.
You go
ahead. We have a whole build-up. So thank you, Dr. Mel.
As our co-host for tonight.
As a producer, I have to do this. So
go ahead.
So everybody knows we started out as singular with Dr. Mel when we first started the show. And I was behind an iPad. Can you believe that? I was behind an iPad. iPad. The show started on an iPad. And then we got kind of fancy and I built out some stuff. And then we became a trio with Lila in LA. Now Lila's going to do her thing. She is caught up in the entertainment industry and doing incredibly. And she has a lot of responsibilities, so she's not.
But she sends all her fans out there her love.
Man, Lila love the fans. You know how Wu-Tang love the kids. Lila Trick Daddy love the kid. Lila loves the fans, so we send her love. But we're starting something new, and we're going to have guest host on.
Yes,
it's incredible. We start tonight.
We start tonight
with an incredible person, just an incredible human being first. And her name is Bria Good. She's a master's of public health and a health professional and reproductive justice advocate. So I'm excited. Can we bring her on, Dr. Mel?
Please do. And she's also a doula and a childbirth educator. So
she's so much. I want everybody to meet her. All right, here we go. There she is. Our guest host. Hold on, I gotta unmute her because there we go.
You want to be a co-host? I can't be muted as a co-host.
You cannot be muted as a guest host. You cannot.
Oh man. Thank you so much for inviting me on this show. I am super excited to be here, and y'all's enthusiasm got me pumped for the show. So I'm ready for today's topics today.
Fantastic.
So everybody send Bria some love in the comments. She's excited about being here. Tell us a little bit about what you do, Bria.
Yeah, so full-time, I'm a research manager at a nonprofit based in California. It's called IBIS Reproductive Health. I do a lot of research on reproductive access across the nation in different countries around the world. And as Dr. Mel also mentioned, I also am a doula and childbirth educator. Just trying to get my full hands in the full reproductive spectrum. So very, very excited to be doing the work that I am right now. It's a little hectic, as everyone knows, but it's
we
great.
know what's going on in the world of reproductive health in these United States. So we are glad that you have taken time away from that to be our co-host tonight. So
all right.
Welcome.
So we just got to go into it. We got to kick it off because this show. I mean, you came in at the right time, Bria. It's an incredible show for tonight, Dr. Mel.
We are going to be talking about, is race real? Is the concept of race, quote unquote, biologically real? Are there, quote unquote, racial differences in health that are a result of genes, racial genes, right? So we're going to be unpacking race here tonight. We have an incredible leading human geneticist who's going to answer if being white or Black is a genetic thing and the role that plays in our health. It's going to be a lit discussion.
Wow. That's incredible. That's incredible. And she's a pioneer in her field. I'm excited to have her on, man. I'm so excited. And like I come from a sports background, watching sports. And way back in the day, people actually believed that Black and white people were different, that we were born with a special high leg muscle that made us.
High pain tolerance.
We know that guy, right? Exactly, Bria. Yep. And we know that commentator got fired, but
Yeah.
But anyway, please share this episode right now. Stop what you're doing. Share it with everybody. Anybody who's ready to get their mind blown with this discussion, and hear what a human geneticist really has to say about whiteness, Blackness, and how our DNA fluidly interacts with our world and even our spirituality. We're going to get into it.
All right. But before we get into it, we have to go to the recap to see what's going on in the week that was.
Yeah, man. Dr. Mel, we got to talk about this COVID update. I feel like every month, every year, COVID's like, I'm back and I'm gone and I'm back and I'm gone. So tell us a little bit what's going on with COVID right now.
Well, the I'm back kind of thing with COVID is because we have not yet mastered that concept of we got to wear masks when we're indoors. So we're just spreading it willy-nilly. Cases are going up. Hospitalizations are going up. They climbed another 5% since last week, specifically the hospitalizations, 6,400 a day. Luckily, the deaths are still holding steady, about 375 deaths a day. Still terrible, but steady. And then, most areas of the country are in a moderate to high level of COVID transmission. So govern yourselves accordingly if you don't want to get COVID or don't want to get COVID again.
Wear your mask.
Just put it on.
Indoors.
Yes. You can breathe, I promise.
Wear your mask.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Mel, the next topic is the bounce back. I mean, President Biden they were reporting that he's no longer testing positive and he was free of COVID, and then the bounce back. Boom.
Yeah. So this is a thing, and I also want to roll in here about how long we're supposed to isolate when we have COVID, right? So the CDC says 5 days at home unless you're very sick, and then it's 10 days. However, several studies are showing that many people with COVID-19 remain infectious well into the second week of symptoms. So past that 5 days, at least 1 in 4 people are still infectious at day 8. Mm-hmm. So that all supports that 10-day isolation period. So if you have the luxury to do it, stay isolated for the 10 days. And if you come out at 5 days, really the CDC is saying wear a well-fitting mask. You should be still masked. It's not like 5 days are up, oh, I'm back out here with my full face. And then Paxlovid, which is the medication that President Biden and many other high-risk individuals take when they get COVID, is 90% effective at keeping you out of the hospital. So it's great. But there's this risk of rebound. So a lot of people have said, oh, President Biden got COVID twice. He didn't get it twice. It just sort of got suppressed by the Paxlovid. And when he stopped the Paxlovid, it came back. And when it comes back after the Paxlovid, studies show that you are still infectious. So he really needs to isolate for that full 10 days. And his doctors may actually put him on another 5-day course of Paxlovid so that it wipes the virus out altogether.
Wow.
So for us, what does that mean for us? To be on the safe side, if you're COVID positive, take your antigen test or your home test, because that's a good test to say, I'm free of the virus. So take that. If it's negative, you can go back out. But if not, you should continue to isolate for the full 10 days.
So that number 2 should have not been the bounce back. It should have been the rebound.
Right. The rebound. There you go. It's the rebound.
We must
For
talk.
your sports, as a sports fan. Yeah.
As a sport, we must talk to our intern.
Yeah.
They have to get it right.
Yeah, exactly.
What are they doing? What do we pay them for?
What's going on?
The fictional intern. Anyway.
Man, as they say sometimes, hide your kids, hide your wife, because ain't nobody safe out here from COVID. So please protect yourselves.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Dr. Mel, this is another thing that's been popping up amongst my friends and my community is vitamin D, right? So everyone's taking vitamin D, talking about it'll keep me healthy, it'll keep me safe. But is vitamin D one of those things that you can take too much of?
Well, absolutely it is. Actually, it's one of the vitamins that sticks around in our fat. So the more we take it, the more it accumulates. And we heard that a British man ended up in the hospital with vitamin D toxicity, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, because he had been following the advice of some private practitioner that he went to, who put him on this dose that was hundreds of times higher than the standard nutritional recommendations. Now, we do still need to get vitamin D every day. It's essential for our cells to carry out multiple duties. And when they're low levels, it's associated with everything from diabetes to falls in older people. So the thing is, folks with darker skin tend to be low in vitamin D. You can get it through getting 15 to 30 minutes of sunlight a day, through your diet, like eating fatty fish, or through supplements. But if you're going to be taking supplements, it's important to do that under the care of a physician who can check your levels and make sure that you're kind of staying on pace and give you a recommended dosage to take if it's low.
That's real smart. I think that's really, really smart, because people just taking vitamin D every day, all types of things, right. No advice, no nothing.
Taking vitamin D, C moss, E, taking vitamin. They just taking stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, that vitamin D specifically, though, it's good if you get your levels checked and followed and put on a specific dosage that's right for you.
Okay, so is that a question we're gonna have to ask the geneticist about vitamin D, or is that something you can answer? Why we are low in it? Why?
Oh yeah, it's because we who have darker skin, who are from the equator where the sun shines more year round, we evolved so that we would get vitamin D based upon the fact that there was lots of sunlight. But as populations migrated to the north, where there's less light, lighter skin became an adaptation so that they could continue to absorb the amount of light that's needed, because melanin blocks sunlight absorption. And so now if you take somebody who's darker skin and put them in colder climates, temperate climates where there's less light, then they're going to be blocking light that they really need to be able to keep up with their vitamin D levels. So that's essentially, that's the deal.
See, we get it all here, Dr. Mel. So look, we had our show on diabetes, and it was
Yeah.
really popular.
It was
Really
great.
popular show. And I told the story of my family like having sugar, but we're finding out now that diabetes is really expensive to have, disease to have.
Yeah, because the cost of insulin has been doubling in the past 10 years. Over 1 million Americans spend more than 40% of their income just on insulin. That's crazy. And so people with type 1 diabetes, that early onset childhood diabetes, that's because you're born not making enough insulin or not making insulin, period. So you need insulin from the outside. But the type 2 diabetes, the type that we talked more about on the show just last week with Dr. Gail Bland, tune into it, go back and watch it if you haven't, because she dropped a whole lot of really, really key knowledge. But basically, if you have type 2 diabetes, which just means that you make insulin, but just not enough for your body, you can decrease your insulin requirement by eating a plant-based diet, or other eating plans like the Mediterranean diet. And she talked about what that was. And the beautiful thing about it is when you do that, it also helps your body in other ways that just taking insulin doesn't. So it's great for your heart health. It's great for decreasing your risk of stroke, your weight. So all those things get helped by sticking to a nutrition plan that works. You might still need insulin, but you probably will need less. So that's really important to keep in mind, even though it might be more challenging. In the end, it's cost effective and healthier to stick to a nutrition plan.
So you can reduce your costs just by eating better.
Correct. Yep.
I'm with
You got
that.
it.
I mean,
Hey, talk about plant-based diets with the Black community. That's a little touchy subject,
right.
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 Well, got to cut down on that salt, cut down on that sugar, and up your vegetables and fruit. And yeah, that's the key.
So what time is it?
What time is it? We can never guess.
It's
Right.
The weekly debunk.
time for the weekly debunk.
Stopping misinformation in its tracks.
All right, Dr. Mel. So all these things are coming up in my conversations with people. And so Dr. Tracy Twitterfingers messaged me this the other day and said, how can you put that poison in your body, girl? They're trying to kill off people with that COVID vaccine. But Dr. Mel, not Mel, nor anyone in my family is going to take that. So they're saying that not them, not anybody in their family is going to take this vaccine.
Wow.
Said, I don't know about that one. Excuse me, Dr. Mel. Is that true? Is it really poison that you're putting in your body?
No, it's not true. Millions of people now have taken the COVID vaccines over the past 2 years, really. It's actually a little more than 2 years when you consider that the trial started in June of 2020. So the vaccines have really undergone and will continue to undergo the most intensive safety monitoring in the history of the United States, including by multiple African American scientists and doctors. And more than many foods, supplements, medications, vaping chemicals that we voluntarily put in our body, right? There's no poison in them. What's basically in them is the genetic material from the virus. As we're going to hear tonight, genetic material is the building block of life. It is not poison. And it is the building block from viruses to dogs to cats to humans, and beyond. So that genetic material is the pattern that's used to make the spike protein so that our body can react to it and make antibodies. The only other things that are in there are fat, which your cells are made of, and it helps to protect the genetic material, the messenger RNA, by providing that greasy exterior that helps it slide into the cell. Salt, like table salt, to help balance the acidity, to make sure that it, fits in with the acidity of your body. And then sugar. like table sugar to help maintain the shape of the molecule. So vaccines are helpful to reduce symptoms of COVID if you get exposed to COVID, shorten the period of the time you can pass it to other people, and lessen complications, like a study that just came out that shows it lessens complications after having COVID from things like stroke, other long COVID symptoms, and diabetes, for example. So, yeah, no poison there. Please
Wow.
tell Tracy Twitterfingers, you know, she doesn't need to be concerned about that. She could talk to her doctor about going ahead and getting boosted if she's gotten one vaccine, but it sounds like she hasn't gotten any. So just going ahead and starting to get that.
So I Bria, I did pull up at the light and saw Tracy Twitterfingers in her car eating flaming hot Cheetos. So
Look, Tracy got a lot of issues. This is one of many. It's a conversation we've been having for 2 years at this point in time. So, like she said, neither her nor her family are going to take this. So, hopefully, your information is going to be helpful for her to go get this vaccine and get boosted.
I hope so. I hope so. So, thank you, Bria and Wayne. We have done this debunk. We are going to move on, and we're going to see you back in a little bit because we're about to move into our show for this evening, which is race real and does it affect your health? Is it accurate to say that because of biology, Black people get diseases like cancer and don't get others like osteoporosis? Are the racial differences in health, are they inevitable because of the genes for race that determine whether we're Black or white? So we're going to break that down on this show today. Is being Black or white a genetic thing or not? And how does that all relate to our health? So to join us, I am just so excited because Dr. Georgia Dunston, who's joining us, is one of my mentors. She is a human geneticist, professor emerita at Howard University College of Medicine, where she was the founding and former director of the National Genome Center. Her work in genetic variation in people of African descent has earned her multiple awards. And now she's the founder, president, and CEO of the Whole Genome Science Foundation, which is a 501c3 organization that was founded to advance human genome research education. Welcome, Dr. Dunston. Thanks so much for joining us on Excuse Me, Doctor.
Welcome. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be with you this evening on this program.
Wonderful. So, look, we have to frame this discussion by first starting off at the basics. What is DNA and what is the human genome? Can you explain that to us?
Well, first of all, DNA stands for the name of a chemical, and that chemical is deoxyribonucleic acid. And that has been abbreviated for the acronym DNA. It is a chemical that is found in all cells of our body. It's what we call an information molecule. It's a chemical molecule that contains information. And the information that it contains is information about our inheritance. It is our genetic information. DNA contains information that's in the cells of our body. And this information is not only about our identity, who we are, but it is also information about how a single cell makes proteins that are the workhorses that's used to make all the parts of our body.
Wow.
And I actually have a slide. If our producer can bring up that slide, it's often said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And anybody who knows
there we
me,
go.
I need a slide because I've been told I Don't have time for 1,000 words tonight. But I put this slide up because I wanted to show the relationship between DNA, our bodies, and how that's related to diseases, and how that's related to different population groups, and how it's ultimately related to the whole of humanity. So just let me say, our bodies are made up of cells. The cells are the units, the smallest units of our body. Every cell that has a nucleus, and that's essentially all of the cells, except mature red blood cells. They do not have a nucleus because they throw out their nucleus. But the trillions of cells in our body contain a nucleus. Inside the nucleus is the DNA, the information inside the cell for how the cell makes the products that the cell needs in order for cells to become tissues, tissues become organs
Like our heart and our
body.
liver and our brain and our skin, right?
Yes, very good. And I like to say different tissues work together to give the different organs, as you said, the liver, the heart. The different organs work together to give different systems. So we have our nervous system, we have our immune system, and we have our skeletal system. The different systems work together to give us whole individuals. Each of us is a collection of different systems that are made of organs, that's made of tissues, that's made of cells, that's made of DNA as our inherited material. But our definition doesn't start at the boundary of the skin, since we're going to be talking about race. So DNA is also involved in how different individuals are grouped together. And we're grouped together in families. All of us are in families. Families are not random. Families make up different populations, and different populations together make up humanity.
So that is incredible, Dr. Dunston. That is an incredible way of taking us from the cell all the way to humanity. And I want to just jump in here because I have heard you say that the story of the human genome, which is a collection of all our DNA, is an African story. Mm-hmm. Why do you say that?
Because the oldest skeletons of what we call modern humans have been found in Africa. So the oldest skeleton, which contains DNA, the oldest modern human forms have been found in Africa. So all human beings come from the roots of humanity in Africa.
And I think that's an important point to make, because then that means that people who are of African descent, first of all, that's all of humanity, but people who are of direct African descent have the most variation in their DNA, right?
Yes, but it's the data show that African people have the greatest amount of variation in their DNA. Okay.
Right.
All humans, the DNA is tremendous variation. Keep in mind, when we start talking about race, we are talking about often people that have their origins from the different continental regions. And we have based our concepts on those similarities from racial groups. However, keep this in mind, that the amount of variation within each group is greater than the variation between groups. So what I'm saying is that all groups have tremendous variation. African people of Africa have the greatest variation, which is related to their antiquity, oldest humans. So since variation occurs over time, the longer you have been around, the greater the variation. So since humanity has its roots in Africa, the genome or the DNA patterns that we see in people of African descent are greatest variation, which is a reflection of African people have been on Earth the longest time.
Which I want to put a pin in both of those things. First of all, the fact that people from Africa have the greatest amount of variation.
Hearing you?
Oh, can you hear me now?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's muted. Can you give me a little more volume?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Can you speak up?
Okay, yes. Can you hear me now? Because I'm speaking now. I'm not sure why you can't hear me. We might need our producer to fix this because I'm speaking and then my mic is on. Okay.
I can't hear her.
So while we're getting that straight, I will. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Well, I was just going to make this point, which is that because African people have the most amount of genetic diversity, when we get left out of research studies about, DNA, they're leaving out a tremendous resource because people from Africa have the most amount of genetic variation. And then there was another thing that you said, which I don't know if everybody caught it, so we need to go back to that, which is the amount of variation within what we call racial groups. So Africans, Asians, Europeans is less than the amount of variation between groups. Is that, or sorry, is more than the amount of variation between groups. So somebody from West Africa and somebody from East Africa, even though they're both quote unquote Black, may have more differences in their DNA than somebody from East Africa who's quote unquote Black and somebody who's from China who's quote unquote Asian, or somebody who is from France who's quote unquote European. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but there's an important point to add. Make sure we add to that. You're correct. The amount of variation between Africans from different parts of Africa is tremendously great. But the key point I was trying to make is when we start relating race to racial groups and relating that to biology, the amount of variation within every group, the amount of variation in Caucasians, for example, is greater than the amount of variation between Blacks and Caucasian.
Right.
The amount of variation within each group, and we gave the example of Africans, for example, but it is true that the amount of variation within each group is greater within the group than it is across groups. So we are more alike than we are different from the DNA perspective. Does that make sense?
Yes. So for example, Nelson Mandela and President Biden might have more DNA similarly between them than President Biden and George Bush. Because they're two Europeans, quote unquote Europeans, or white people, right?
Yes.
They actually may be more genetically different than President Biden is to an African person like Nelson Mandela?
Yes. Yes, the difference within the group is greater than differences across racial groups. Indeed. Right. But oftentimes that point is missed when you come within any racial group. And that's why I said the racial group: Caucasian, American Indians, Black folk, any what we call racial group, the amount of variation within the group is much greater than the amount of variation across groups. Then, just like you said again, 2 Black people in America, 2 African Americans can be more different, although they are both in the racial group Black America, then each of them may be to a Caucasian.
Right.
So they may be more, 2 Blacks can be more different than that Black is to a Caucasian. That's right.
And that's because DNA does so much more than just determine whether our hair is straight or curly, or whether our skin, how much melanin we have in our skin. That's just the tip of the iceberg, right? In terms of what DNA actually codes for, the information that you said that's in it, right? What are some of the other things that DNA does where there's all this variation involved?
That is a great question, and for the audience to recognize that what this Human Genome Project showed us is that the amount of DNA that we contain, and then we say these molecules, more than 3 billion of the building blocks of DNA in our total inherited information. When we sequenced the genome, one of the first startling numbers, data that came up, was that the amount of our DNA that's needed to make all the proteins that are responsible for differences we see in racial groups, surface differences, skin color, anatomical features, hair color, eye color, all of the information for any difference that we have between groups that we see on the surface is less than 1/10 of 1% of our total genetic information.
That's
less
crazy.
than 1/10 of 1% of our total genetic information can account for all of the differences that we see, especially on the surface that we use to group ourselves into racial groups. If you consider all of the information that's needed to make all of the parts inside the body, the heart, all the organs, the tissues we're talking about, that's less than 2% of our total inheritance. That brings up the fact that most of our DNA contains information about that we are still determining what that information is about. After all, everything we make, every part of the body we make has to be controlled. And there's a lot of information in our DNA that is used for controlling what we make, or what we call regulatory DNA. My point is, the information, the DNA that's used to make everything that we use to categorize ourselves in racial groups is less than 1/10 of 1%
of all that information.
So
how does, we've heard a lot, it's kind of in the popular science that, when we are exposed to a trauma, and then we give birth to a child, there are changes that can happen in our DNA that then get passed on to that child. Can you just tell us a little bit of how does our DNA get changed by trauma, and how does that get passed on?
That's an excellent question too, because it's very important that we recognize that our environment plays a big role, not only in what our DNA molecules look like or their sequence. A DNA molecule is a sequence of the building blocks. And my point is that environment plays a role in how that information in DNA is turned on, turned off, and that influences all the systems of the body. So all of the systems can be influenced by the environment. So you talk about trauma and microaggression, especially as we try to understand what's the biology behind the experience, for example, that we as a people have had from years of slavery, which can surely be looked at in terms of trauma. And so there's a big interest in how much of that experience is reflected in the DNA that is associated with diseases that we see in African Americans, for example. So this big area we call epigenetics, and changes that can occur in DNA that gets passed on from one generation to the next, or certainly from one cell to another.
So there are a few diseases like sickle cell or cystic fibrosis, where there's one gene that has a variation that's found more in people of African descent or people of European descent, for example. But the vast majority of diseases, is what I'm hearing you say, are more influenced by the way that our DNA interacts with our environment and how we interpret our environment, right? And our diets and the things that bind us culturally. So we might have more in common culturally with other African Americans in this country than we have genetically. And the way that we respond to our environment that's determined culturally, and what has happened to us, as you mentioned, our history, that puts us at greater risk for certain diseases. It's not necessarily purely the fact that we have the same genes or exact same genes. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, that's a very, very big area of very active investigation, is how does the environment influence our DNA, our inheritance. And we know that, I want to say, we use terms like cystic fibrosis. That's a disease. Sickle cell anemia. That's a disease that we find higher frequency in Blacks. And thalassemia is another blood disorder that we find in Mediterranean, higher frequency in Mediterranean people. It is very important that we understand there is no one-to-one relationship between a gene and a disease. Every disease is very complex in terms of its genetics. There are many genes, hundreds, and possibly even thousands of genes that can be involved in producing that disease or that we're talking about. You talk about, so keep in mind, there's no one-to-one. So it's not a gene for cystic fibrosis. There's no gene for breast cancer. There's no gene for hypertension. Although when it's reported, and maybe the public, when they talk, we found the gene for hypertension. Right. But what you found is a gene that plays a role in the expression of that complex disease.
So
And
I can't believe that we having such a rich discussion, but we have to get the audience in here. So I got to bring back Wayne and Bria because they're going to be bringing in those audience comments, those audience questions. I can't believe that there's
Wow.
nothing going on in chat. So
The chat is going crazy right now.
Chat is crazy. Chat is crazy.
all right,
I'm
what do we have?
Dr. Dunston. It's so much incredible knowledge. Thank you so much. We're learning
Thank you.
so much. Bria.
Well, let's kick it off with the first question. First question today comes from Maria Sendos, and this was sent a little bit earlier, so they were on it quick. The question is, how do we account for such high European percentages in most African Americans when it comes to health and well-being in conjunction with race? And how does this affect us, essentially, especially since phenotype may not necessarily coincide with genotype?
okay, please, can you repeat? How do we account for, what was that question, the beginning of it?
Yeah, how do we account for such high European percentages in most African Americans?
Yeah, let's answer that first.
Yes, well, all we have to do is look at what we call the population history of African Americans. If we're talking specific about African Americans, the genome of Africa on average has about 25% European genes. By European genes, we mean genes that, and keep in mind, a gene refers to a DNA sequence, okay? A DNA sequence. And genes differ based on the order of the building blocks in that sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say 25% European genes, it's not like there is a one-to-one relationship between the gene and European. Keep that in mind, first of all. So the point I'm trying to make is the population history of African Americans, our tremendous admixture with Europeans that's tied to the history of African Americans in America. We know the social history there of the mixing of the interaction of the slave holders with the slaves, and so there's entry of European genetics into the African gene pool. We also have a mixture with American Indians. Many Blacks will know, they know from their history, we got some Indian in our American Indian
Right.
in our family.
And
So,
if I could just jump in, I mentioned that Dr. Dunston was the founding director of the National Human Genome Center. Any of you who all are familiar with African Ancestry, the company, actually had its origins in the National Human Genome Center. So those statistics that she's quoting, about 25 or 35% African Americans have European backgrounds, that came out of a lot of the genetic testing that company and other research projects have done.
let me correct you there, because
Okay,
the African Ancestry genetic testing, Ancestry testing became very big with the Genome Project. But that particular testing was not done in the National Human Genome Center, but
Right.
our molecular geneticist in the Genome Center, Dr. Rick Kittles,
Right.
actually formed this company, AfricanAncestry.com, in
Yes.
which, because his research involved genetic tests in different African groups. And so his research allowed him to be able to set that up as an independent business. So I just want to make sure that.
But it grew out of the National Human Genome Center work that he started there.
Well, not his company. Company.
I understand. Yeah, the
However,
work.
genetic variation in Africa, that was the business of the Genome Center.
Exactly.
So you are correct there.
So
the Genome Center came in to bring Africans into the mainstream of human genome work. And
which is really,
actually,
really important.
America Project was the first national project on the genome, with the Genome Project, between Africa and America. And yes, the investigator who was head of epidemiology, Dr. Charles Rotimi, was very instrumental in bringing African people into this study because he had research collaboration. So thank you. The National Human Genome Center, yes.
I want to make sure that we get in some more questions though, but
Right.
thank you for that.
So we have another question. This question, and follows that line, comes from Valerie Spalding Parker. She says, how accurate is Ancestor DNA and other similar tests? Ancestry DNA, I think she was.
Accurate in, I'm not quite sure how much.
I think what she's saying is, when you get the test result and it says that, your mother's 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 mother, came from the Balanta tribe.
Yes.
Or another company might tell you you're 50% Yoruba and 20% Awe, and so how accurate is that information they give you?
And that's a very good question. And you have to be very careful. Keep in mind that the accuracy of your information is only as good as your database for how you're determining what the ancestry is. The more accurate DNA from diverse, say, African people, the greater your chance of being able to relate an individual to a given African. Keep in mind, in all of this ancestry testing, it's based on an individual's DNA. The question is, how similar is your DNA when you compare the sequence of a set of genes? And it's not the whole genome that's being compared, but it's a set of genes that we look at. And the question is, how similar are your genes to DNA across the world or wherever your DNA resource? If you got a lot of DNA from different parts of Africa, your chances of being able to relate your test DNA to a place in Africa is going to be greater if you have more resource material from Africa. When ancestry testing came out, most of the resource material that the ancestry people had came from their research and was heavy with European samples and very few African samples.
Right.
So the accuracy of you, if you will, of any unknown or test DNA was going to be limited to how great your resource for the world's DNA, because all you're doing is matching. You're asking the question in ancestry testing, where in the world is their DNA that's most similar to yours?
Right. So we may have to go into
the first to do that.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to we need to move on because we may have to go to the lightning round.
Bria, we're in the lightning round. What you got?
Let's go. So you talked a little bit about how we are more similar to other races than we think we are. So this comes from Bonita McNeil. And so they ask, so in terms of organ donor matches, who is a better match?
That's again, this is so good. I know. As I said, of our total DNA, when I say less than 1/10 of 1% is matched based on is determined surface characteristics, which we use for identifying groups. Most of our DNA, we don't even know what all of the DNA does. We can find genes, and we know we have about 20,000, 22,000 genes, but most of the sequence of our DNA, we don't know what it does. Mm-hmm. So I like to say that most of our inheritance is about what we can't see. what we can't measure. And remember, science deals only with what we can measure, what we can see.
Right.
So I'm
So
saying
for the
that
organ matching,
the statement that we are more alike than we are different is based on the fact that 92% of the DNA from any two people anywhere in the world is the same.
Mhm.
If you take two people from anywhere in the world, 96% of their DNA is going to be exactly the same.
so for
And we
purposes of
don't
organ
know all
matching,
the things.
so I just want to jump in, Dr. Dunston. For purposes of organ matching, then it doesn't necessarily mean that a Black person has to give another Black person a kidney. A Black person, African American, could get a kidney from any racial group. Is that correct?
The fact is, but keep in mind that our DNA similarities, the sequences are more, the likelihood of you having a particular gene sequence is greater with your ethnic group, your racial group, if you will. In other words, there are certain genes that are involved in whether an organ will match or not.
Okay.
I studied this set of genes. We call them our tissue antigen genes.
Okay.
So when we want to match a donor and a recipient for an organ, we look at what's the DNA sequence in the donor and what's the DNA sequence of the recipient. And we have found that if you match the genes that control these particular set of genes that are involved in donor recipient matches, you can equate that to the success of the transplant. But yes, if you just take one individual that's Black, that person may be closer to their tissue antigen, might be closer to a white person than to another Black. So you can't match the biology
Right.
based on
skin color.
Right.
So we're in the lightning round. So Valerie Spalding says we may need part 2.
I think we might need part 2. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question, and maybe we can answer that in the chat later, and comes from Marie Claire Brown. But I want to get to this one question because it's a great question. Max Gregory Anderson says, what does it mean, dominant and recessive genes? Since we're going along, Gene.
That's good.
Yes. Dominant means if you have the genes, you can identify the product of the product of the gene will be expressed. It's dominant. Compared to recessive, you can have a gene, but you don't see in your testing methods. But you see, I say that very carefully because now that we can sequence genes, we can literally identify exactly what gene you have, and recessive only refers to its expression in such a way that you can see it. Okay, recessive means that it is not expressed or you can't measure its effect. Dominant is you can measure its effect and you can see it.
All right.
And that has to do too with, you get a gene from your father, you get a gene from your mother. If one of those is dominant, let's say for hair color, then that's gonna be the one that expresses as compared to the gene from the other parent. So that's also another way you can think of it.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
so wow, this has just been way too short. Thank you so much, Dr. Georgia Dunston. You were incredible with your information. We're gonna have to probably have you back because there's a whole spirituality and DNA piece we didn't even get to. Thank you.
What is the rest of that information? What is the rest of our
What is the rest of the information? That's gonna be part 2.
And
thank you so much, Bria Good, for joining us as our co-host.
Bria.
Fantastic. You were incredible. Of course, thank you to my wonderful producer and co-host Wayne Bruce. I just want to also remind everybody, don't pass up this COVID resilience study opportunity at Howard University. It's totally voluntary, but if you participate and fill out just 2 surveys, you can be compensated up to $100. So any interest, contact my assistant, Dana Harvey, at danaharveyresearch@gmail.com. That's DANAHARVEY research@gmail.com. Y'all, my audience, the Be Health Empowered family, thanks for joining us again this week. Thanks for those fantastic questions you put in the chat. We will have a part 2, so don't give up hope if you didn't get your question answered tonight. And I will see you next week. And in the meantime, please remember, be wise, be well, and be health empowered. Thanks for joining.
So I guess I should thank the Robinsons. They invited me. They still don't know. I hooked up with Dave 3 days ago. He'll start coughing tomorrow. And I bet in 10 days he'll be on a ventilator. Now his wife, she's not vaccinated because she thinks it'll prevent her from being pregnant. But what they don't know is that I can decrease sperm count. Sorry, Dave.